Welcome at long last to episode 17 of the History of BBC Micro Typing Games, where I look at game listings for the Beeb that featured in the many computer magazines of the 8-bit era, and of course play them. As well as trying to work out if it was worth the time it took to type these games in, I also tried to pick out some interesting content from the magazines to help give a flavour of the home computing scene at that time. Incredibly, it's been over 6 months since the last episode of this series, and I can only apologise for the delay producing this. I could reel off a list of reasons why, but instead let's just get on with it, shall we? In this episode, I'll start my coverage of typing listings from 1986, looking at 5 publications that cover the first quarter of that year. By 1986, the Beeb was very much lagging behind the hugely popular Commodore 64, Spectrum, and the more recently released Amstrad CPC 464 in the home user base. Sales were still relatively strong in the UK educational and commercial sectors, but international sales were weak and Acorn officially withdrew from the US market this year. In early '86, Acorn released a follow-up to the BBC Micro in the form of the Master, which offered memory sizes from 128K and many other improvements on its 5-year-old predecessor's hardware. It essentially had the same 6502 based architecture, but with many of the upgrades supported by the original design now included on the circuit board as internal plug-in modules. Games-wise, there was still fairly good support for the machine from the software houses that specialised in the system, but many cross-platform publishers such as Ocean and US Gold scaled back their support for the Beeb. 2 highly regarded and technically impressive games made their debut this year, originating on the BBC Micro before later finding greater fame on other 8-bits. The Sentinel was Jeff Crammond's follow-up to Revs and was published by Firebird, while Thrust was released by Superior Software on the Beeb, though Firebird would release it at budget price for all other systems. Superior continued to be the biggest providers of quality games for the Beeb and had a number of other high-profile releases this year, including Raven Skull, Striker's Run and Repton 3. Micropower published one of the Beeb's finest exclusive games, Imogen, but this proved to be the company's last release for the system as they faced financial problems. However, a new company called Tynesoft began publishing a large number of games for the system, including a port of Jet Set Willy, original titles such as Future Shock and Vindaloo, and a host of sports games. Magazine coverage for the system continued to be strong, with Acorn-dedicated publications like the Micro User, BBug and Acorn User still being released each month, while Cross-Platform Mag continued to regularly feature BBC Micro news, reviews and games listings. With that said, let's take a look at the first of the 5 magazines in this episode, and it's the January 1986 edition of the Micro User, Volume 3 number 11 to be precise, with a cover price of £1.25. The big feature in this issue is a pull-out supplement which is a guide to playing Elite, and that dominates the front cover, with the artwork depicting a space fighter in a fetching pink and green suit, engaging in combat with a number of isometrically shaped opponents. One nice touch is the control panel of his ship, which in addition to featuring the usual flight stick, also has a BBC Micro keyboard encased in it. The only other thing mentioned on the front cover are 2 new series to help beginners on Basic and Machine Code. At this point, I'm going to mention that there are going to be a few changes to this series going forward to help speed up the production process. I'm generally only going to pick out a couple of articles from each magazine, and in the cross-platform ones I'm typically only going to focus on BBC Micro related content. There will be a few exceptions, of course. So diving into this issue of the Micro User, the first thing I'm going to take a look at is the Microlink newsletter, and specifically this article at the top entitled "Now It's Email with Flowers." To me, this is the earliest example of the expression email that I've seen, and to be honest I was quite shocked to find it in a publication from 1986. For most people, the expression email wouldn't have come into common usage until the mid-90s. Anyway, this article says now Microlink subscribers can say it with flowers at whatever hour of the day or night the mood strikes them, and their floral gift will be delivered anywhere in the British Isles. Microlink has joined forces with the world-famous flower delivery service Interflora to create FloraLink, which for the first time ever enables people to send flowers and plants by way of their computer. It goes on to say FloraLink will have 24 hours a day open access, and deliveries by Interflora's 2,700 members can usually be made any day other than Sunday. After giving an overview of the type of products available, it says FloraLink will carry a price list to give subscribers an idea of just what is available, and payment for the flowers can be made by credit card. It doesn't mention exactly how you supply your credit card details, but I can't imagine it was too secure back then. If there's anyone watching this video that used this service back in the mid-80s, then please let me know how it worked in the video comments. I've now jumped all the way to the back page of the magazine, and this advert for Superior Software's classic arcade adventure Citadel, which was released at the tail end of 1985. At the top it says the best arcade adventure ever, which is a bold claim, but it is a very good game. There are 12 colourful screenshots from the game, and below them it says a huge adventure featuring over 100 beautifully detailed screens packed with challenging puzzles and awesome foes. You start in the vast 3-towered Citadel with its curious cellar and well. Should you survive the perils within, you can venture onto the Witch's House, Stonehenge, the Pyramids, and across the desert to the mountains. Cross the ocean and you'll reach the Mystic Temple on the island. You should devise how to use the ice crystal, trampolines, cannonballs, Egyptian statues, etc. to the best advantage in your onerous mission. Cleverly realistic animation, including flickering torches, splashing water and smouldering furnaces, is used throughout to depict your movements and to vividly portray the fearsome monks, mummies and wolves. Doesn't make a huge amount of sense, that last sentence, but anyway, as with previous releases such as Repton 1 and 2, Superior Software are offering the chance to win prizes. In this case there are two different ones. 3 crowns have been craftily hidden within the adventure, and the first person to locate any 2 of the 3 crowns will win £100. And also, the maximum score which can be obtained is 99 points, and the first person to reach this score will be presented with an impressive personal engraved shield and a cheque for £200. So plenty of incentive to purchase the game then, although I have to say, achieving either of those things was incredibly difficult. At the bottom of the ad is some artwork which doesn't really depict the game very well, along with an interpretation of the iconic hooded glowing-eyed monks that inhabit the game. Moving back inside the magazine to page 68, here we have the game listing for this magazine, and as you can see, the game is called Megaroids and it's illustrated by a very simple but busy piece of artwork that shows a spaceship hurtling past a load of planets, or in fact I think these are supposed to be the Megaroids of the title. Below that nicely stylised title it says "Brave the perils of hyperspace in this high-speed game by Peter Mutabe." I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It then says, as captain of an interstellar fighter there's only one way to escape the pursuing Cylons. You press the hyperspace button and immediately the turbo boosters burst into action. As you enter hyperspace you realise that your craft is heading straight for a Megaroid storm. Megaroids being asteroids which only exist in hyperspace. There's nothing you can do except guide your craft past the oncoming Megaroids, but remember your shields will only survive 2 direct hits. Another thing that's changing from this episode of this series onwards is I'm not going to be covering the type-in listing section of the magazines in anywhere near as much detail as I used to. I will of course give a quick overview of what's provided by each magazine, but when it comes to the listing I'm not going to be pointing much more out than how long it is and whether it's basic or machine code. So with that in mind, this takes the format of almost all micro user listings, with a box out that summarises all the variables and procedures used in the game, a handy reference point for when you're looking at the code, and in this case also a box out that tells you the keys, which are just left, right and start a new game. This one's going to be pretty simple I think. The listing then begins in a very small box out on the right hand side, before you have to turn to page 167 later in the magazine to see the rest of it. Moving to that page now, you can see the listing occupies 2 full pages, with a final line count of about 250. It's a combination of basic along with some machine code sections, and it's laid out neatly with rem statements throughout to help you work out what each section of code is doing. As we already saw from earlier in the magazine, it makes extensive use of procedures, and you can also see that the instructions are shown in game. Speaking of instructions, another change I'm going to be making to this series is I'm not going to be reading out the instructions when they're displayed in game. I'll do a quick visual skim through them, and if necessary I'll read them out while the gameplay is being shown, because I think that's more interesting than seeing a static instruction screen. So with that, let's take a look at the game. This one just features a very simple single page instruction screen, which repeats the information that we've already seen in the magazine. It's just plain white text in mode 7 with a flashing title. When you press the spacebar to move on from that screen, you're asked to enter a level of difficulty from 0 to 5, with 0 being the most difficult and 5 being the most easy. Once you've done that, the game switches to mode 2 and displays the keyboard controls, and there's also a neat effect as 3 asteroids hurtle towards the bottom of the screen and the words "press spacebar" are printed. No surprise that pressing the spacebar begins the game, and when you do so it takes absolutely ages to draw a star field on screen, and then plays a long intro tune before the gameplay commences. Subsequent replays at the same difficulty level don't redraw the stars, but that intro is always there and is unskippable. Once the game eventually does start, you get a pretty impressive into the screen scrolling starfield effect and well drawn 3D style graphics for your ship and the Megaroids, which expand as they get closer. There are reasonable sound effects for the ship's engine and the inevitable asteroid collisions, which also result in a nice explosion effect. If you get a high score, you're also treated to a fairly recognisable rendition of Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen 4. The gameplay is unfortunately very simplistic, as you just dodge left and right to avoid the roids. Fast reactions and judgment are needed, but there's not a lot to it. The only thing that adds variety is the choice of difficulty levels. Easy is just too easy, while the hardest level is very fast and actually quite impressive in that respect, as the game relentlessly throws obstacles at you. If you want to change the difficulty, you'll have to reset the game, which can be done by pressing escape. This is a well-made game from the technical point of view, but there's not much lasting appeal due to the simple gameplay. Tweaks such as the speed increasing the longer you play, or some kind of reward for lasting a while such as limited invulnerability, or the ability to shoot the Megaroids would have added a little more longevity, but even then it wouldn't be likely to keep you interested for long. Up next we have the January 1986 edition of Your Computer magazine, which has got a very interesting front cover featuring Sir Clive Sinclair with his head tilted, with the caption "Nightclubbing, we bust open the real Sir Clive." That does sound like an interesting article, but I'm not going to be looking at that. What I am going to be looking at though is something mentioned at the very bottom of the cover, which is Mastertronic's Price Zappers, and there's a picture of the classic cane there to illustrate it. Good job really, as I'm not sure who noticed this red text on that background. The first thing I'm going to look at inside though is a software shortlist, which is their name for the reviews section. On the first page of this there's reviews of Commando and Rambo for the Commodore 64, which have some very similar looking screenshots, but it's the following page that I'm more interested in, as it features reviews of Repton 2 and Citadel for the Beeb. Repton 2 gets an overall rating of 3 out of 5, with the reviewer saying Repton 2 is a rattling good play. The review I'm more interested in though is the one for Citadel, since we just looked at the advert in the previous magazine. Reviewer Simon Beasley begins by saying 100 screens, a host of animated characters, secret rooms, a teleport system, excited? Well, maybe not. Even on the BBC, epic arcade adventures are nothing new. But new titles of any sort on the BBC are scarce these days, so owners should certainly be grateful for Citadel. And to be fair, 100 screens is probably a record number to pack into the machine's limited memory space. Not sure that claim's accurate, but this is illustrating what I was saying at the beginning of this video, which was that BBC Micro releases were starting to dwindle from any publishers other than the most dedicated ones. The review goes on to say the game's graphics and general level of invention are not in the same league as Castle Quest, but Citadel is a tough nut to crack nonetheless. Even getting past the first few screens proved too much for this reviewer. He obviously wasn't very good at it, I didn't think it was that difficult. The reviewer goes on to praise the fact that the game uses energy rather than lives, and is also pleased with the sheer variety of different locations. At the end he says interplanetary travel in an arcade adventure can't be bad, and the scale of the game makes up for any lack of novelty. He gives it an overall rating of 3 out of 5, which I think is a little bit harsh, but then he's probably not a BBC Micro fan like I am. On the following page though, there's a review of the last V8 for the C64, and although it is reviewed by a different person, it's given an overall rating of 4 out of 5, which is absolutely ridiculous given how short and difficult it is. On the subject of Mastertronic games though, I'll move on to page 44 in the article entitled Masterpieces. On the right hand side it says Paul Bond, who was the reviewer of the last V8 by the way, meets Mastertronics, a threat to the establishment or a promise. Yep, they're referred to as Mastertronics, not Mastertronic, and that mistake is repeated throughout this article. I'm sure you already know that I have a great interest in Mastertronic, having collected and reviewed every game for the Commodore 64. That was in fact the foundation for this channel, so I was certainly interested in reading this article, and while I'm not going to read out the whole thing here, I will pick out some interesting points. The article is illustrated by some nice big colour screenshots of some of Mastertronic's most famous games at this point in time, including Kane, One Man and His Droid, Spellbound, and I'm not sure what this one is on the right hand side here, possibly a Commodore 16 or Amstrad game. I'm sure someone who knows what it is can let me know in the comments though. The piece begins by summarising the rise of the company, saying April 1984, it began quietly, insidiously, rumours about cheap software, pocket money games. The establishment scoffed, it couldn't be done. Look at the overheads, paying distributors, duplicators, artwork and advertising costs, sometimes even the programmers wanted a cut. The product would be cheap and nasty and would blemish the noble escutcheon of the British games software industry, which apparently was so altruistic it made Dr. Bernardo look like Richard Branson. There's then some quotes from the company's John Maxwell, saying companies that said Mastertronic was bad for the industry have gone. They're not around and we are. He goes on to say Activision, Ocean, Melbourne House, those kind of companies are all far too professional and far too good to worry about the penetration of other people into the marketplace. After an overview of the company structure, it then says savings in volume is the keynote of Mastertronic's philosophy. To be profitable, Colin Johnson says their games must outsell competitors at a ratio of 4 to 1. But, for example, in boots we're selling at a ratio of about 6 or 7 to 1, so we're outperforming considerably. An interesting stat to pick out from the next paragraph is that according to Gallup, Mastertronic dominates a mammoth 18.47% of the entertainment software market. The question about whether Mastertronic is quantity over quality is asked, and the response gives some insight into how they pick the games. At the start, we certainly went for bulk, said Maxwell. We wanted to build up a team of people we could rely on. We get about 200 games sent in every month, and we look at everything. If there's a spark of something, we contact that person. A good machine code programmer is not your average run-of-the-mill person. They're very serious, thirsting after knowledge all the time. He estimated that there are as few as 100 really top-class machine code programmers in the country. There's some detail about the Darling brothers who contributed many early games to the Mastertronic range, and the lawsuit that came about from the use of Michael Jackson's Thriller as the music in the game Chiller. There's also some information about the at this point upcoming Mad range, which will be selling games at $2.99 instead of $1.99. There's also a bit of information later in the article that gives some insight into the Acorn software market. Colin Johnson said they were at a meeting the other day and a man for a software house stood up and asked the WH Smith's representative why they had dropped his company's entire range. The rep replied that Smiths no longer carried BBC and Electron software, which was all this guy's company did. So that's another bit of evidence that the BBC games market was starting to decline. The article's rounded out with another quote saying Mastertronic always assumed there was a market for high playability impulse purchase games with the short life cycle. Even if kids bought one every 2 weeks, they'd still take 2 months to spend the same amount of money that they would spend on a full price game. And as we all know, not all the games were good, but for £2 they were hard to resist, so I think they got that strategy bang on. Let's move on to the games listing for this magazine, and this one is called Locomotion, and you can see it's illustrated by two very similar looking screenshots, grainy grayscale ones showing a train in the middle of the screen, some tracks below, and well, not much else because of the greyness. The game was provided by Brian Lewis, and the intro said the game is written for the BBC and Electron and features full screen scrolling, animated multicoloured graphics and original music. The game is written in 2 parts which have to be typed, checked and saved and then run. The first program contains all the machine code routines, while the second sets up the screen, checks the number of lives left, plays the music and controls most of the aspects of the game which don't require the speed of machine code. It then gives a summary of what you have to do in the game. I'll skip over that for now until we look at the game itself. And it then says to scroll the whole screen on the Electron would take too long for a playable game to be written around it. So instead of making a window and scrolling just a small but concentrated box, as in Jump Jet Assault, no idea what that game is, Brian simply scrolled small sections of the screen, such as the track and radar the full length of the screen, giving a more pleasing overall effect. It says the short musical sequences are original and previously composed on a Roland keyboard. And it rounds off by saying if BBC users wish to type in the programme, they must once again increase the contents of the X and Y registers in line 400 of listing 1, and the particular values have to be found through experiment. That seems a little bit strange. The 2 listings are then crammed into 2 boxes across this 2-page spread. The first one, featuring all the machine code, has a really small text size, which is not ideal considering you've got a load of data statements and machine code instructions to get right. Listing 2, as in basic, is a lot shorter and the text size is a little more legible. So having seen that first listing, this is one of those games where you would have had to get your magnifying glass out and been very careful when typing it in. Luckily, I don't have to bother because someone else has already done it for me, and with that, let's take a look at it. I'm sure you probably noticed on listing 2 that this game includes the instructions, and here they are crammed into a single screen with several paragraphs in boring white text. I'll come back to how to play the game in a moment, but if you press the spacebar, you're then given the keyboard controls, which are A and Z for up and down, space to fire a horizontal missile, and return to fire smoke out the chimney of the train. Pressing space again then switches to mode 2 and displays the initial title screen, with the train taking centre stage, and pressing space again kicks things off. You take control of a runaway steam locomotive in which the brakes have failed and there's no hope of stopping. There are still more setbacks on your journey, as from the air you're constantly being attacked by aeroplanes and airships, while back on the rails someone has unleashed a train-seeking C5. Your train has an early warning radar system displayed at the bottom of the screen, which shows you what is ahead on the tracks and in the air. To defend the train, it's fitted with a harpoon gun at the front to deal with the C5, and radioactive smoke to cope with the planes. To fire the harpoon you simply press the spacebar, but to control the smoke takes a little bit more intricacy. Firstly, you can have up to 3 pieces of smoke in the air at one time, but secondly, and more importantly, the longer you hold the fire button down, the higher the smoke goes, flying to the left of the screen once released. If you haven't already worked it out or aren't familiar with the original, this game is a clone of Tony Crowther's C64 game Loco, released by Alligator Software in 1984. At first glance, it appears to be a reasonable recreation of that game in terms of looks, speed and basic gameplay. The graphics and screen layout are fairly similar and the scrolling is decent, but the sound effects are crude and there are no train noises or music despite what the magazine said. Maybe there's a bug preventing it from being played. The overall presentation is good with the split screen and the game does record a high score. Once you start playing it though, there are a number of differences compared to Crowther's game. It seems to be endless with no stations to reach like in the original, and the refuelling element is missing too. It's very hard right from the start, with every airborne enemy dropping bombs on you, and there's no margin for error when trying to hit them with the smoke. It's tough to keep an eye on both views of the train at once, but that's true of the original in fairness. You just end up constantly firing the forward shots to try and get rid of the C5 that appears periodically. That's a fun addition by the way, as a sly nod to one of Acorn's rivals. The game is a little buggy too, as the train disappears off the overhead view occasionally, though that doesn't have any great impact as the track layout is much simpler than in the C64 game. As I said, this initially looks like a decent clone of Loco, but it lacks the subtleties of the original game and is just too hard to make you persist with it for long. Some code tweaks to stop the planes bombing you right from the start would definitely make it a little more fun, as well as something to give more of a sense of progression. For the third game in this episode, I'm moving on to Popular Computing Weekly magazine, Volume 5, Number 6, with a cover date of the 6th to the 12th of February 1986. One thing to point out here is that it also mentions that this is now with Home Computing Weekly, so I'm assuming that magazine was absorbed into Popular Computing Weekly sometime prior to this issue. News on the cover of this one includes Amstrad to launch a new PCW machine, a feature about the Atari 520 ST series, musical bundles for the Commodore 64, a new charity tape from War on Want, and Sinclair selling pocket TV rights to Timex. But I'm not going to be looking at any of that in detail. Instead, I'm going to jump to page 12 on this short interview with Stephen Crow, the programmer of games from Bubble Bus Software, which include Factory Breakout, Wizard's Lair and Starquake. There's a little fact file about him on the right hand side, and at this point in time he was aged 20. His favourite programs include Missile Command, Defender and Night Law, and his favourite machine is the Spectrum, but he does say that the new spate of machines such as the Atari ST and Amiga look astounding. And his hobbies include cycling and swimming, but he doesn't really have much time and actually considers his work as a hobby. In the interview he says he got into programming at school about 5 years prior, where he took up computer studies. The school had Research Machines 380Zs, which is one of the machines I used at school actually, which though limited in memory were quite adequate for those days. He then bought a ZX81, which is what he learned programming on, and then the Spectrum came out and he bought that. After writing a few basic games that weren't all that good, he learnt machine code as a natural progression and programmed his first commercial game, Factory Breakout. With his next game, Wizard's Lair, he approached Bubble Bus, who were based locally, and it was accepted on the spot and he's been with the company ever since. He develops his games on a Tatung Einstein and then downloads the code onto the Spectrum through the RS-232 connection. But he creates all the graphics on the Spectrum using a pencil and lots of plotting paper to design them. He goes on to say he has an enormous admiration for Ultimate, which has done a lot for the Spectrum, and really his programs are a compliment to theirs. You can certainly say that's the case with Wizard's Lair, which was very clearly influenced by Attic Attack. He says the greatest thing he's ever achieved in his programming is getting people to like the games he makes. At that point in time he was happy where he was, and in the future hopes to develop software that has more depth and a greater adventuring role. Closely related to that article about Mastertronic that I looked at in the last magazine, on the opposite page in this one is an advert from Mastertronic looking for programmers. Could you be the next in line for success, it says, and beneath a rogues gallery featuring David Jones, Ed Hickman, Rob Hubbard and Stephen Curtis, with photos I'm sure some of them regretted in later life. It says Mastertronic, the UK's leading computer games company, is looking for new talent. We're searching for people who are not just experienced machine code operators but world-class programmers as well. People who aim to be the latest on a distinguished list of highly acclaimed, highly paid Mastertronic program creators, originating games that will be sold through our worldwide distribution network to no less than 18 countries. If you think you can meet the challenge, contact us now for more details. You could become the Mastertronic success story of 1986. Nothing more to say about this one really, other than ask the question, who scares you most from those 4 mugshots? For me, I think it has to be David Jones because of those eyes. One thing I like to do in every episode of this series is take a look at the game charts for a particular point in time, and this episode is no exception, as here on page 35 are the game charts for February 1986. This magazine features a number of charts, including a top 20 compiled by Gallup, a reader's chart, and 5 different system-specific top 10s as well. Let's start by looking at the top 20, and as you can see, it's dominated by Mastertronic games. It doesn't seem entirely fair to put those in with games from other publishers, given the price difference, but that's what's happened, and almost half the top 20 is taken up with games from the budget publisher, including Action Biker at number 5, BMX Racers at number 10, and Caves of Doom, One Man and His Droid, Finders Keepers, Rockman and Formula 1 Simulator also making up the numbers. Full price titles do still occupy the top 3 though, with Melbourne House's Rock and Wrestle, Imagine's Ye Are Kung Fu and Elite's Commando topping the charts, along with the US Gold published Winter Games in 4th place. All quality titles for the C64 in my view, so you'll get no arguments from me there. Commando and Winter Games also feature at the top of the reader's chart, along with Elite. Elsewhere in that chart is the adventure game Lord of the Rings, Ye Are Kung Fu again, Mastertronic's Spellbound and Way of the Exploding Fist, along with Rambo and Mercenary. The one title I haven't mentioned is actually a compilation, They Sold a Million. That also features in the Gallup Top 20 along with Computer Hits 10, and just as with the budget titles, I don't think it's entirely fair to be including compilations in these charts either, as they're bound to be big sellers compared to individual titles. As you can see below the reader's chart, you get the opportunity to vote for a future one, and there's also a very convoluted competition where you can win £25 by coming up with the most original phrase or sentence made up from the letters in the titles of the top 3 programs in that week's reader's chart. So in this case you'd have to make a witty, neat or clever, but never rude phrase from the letters of Commando, Elite and Winter Games. Not much to go on there. Anyway, back to the charts, and I'll finish by looking at the top 10 BBC Micro games. There are several cross-platform titles in there, including Ye Are Kung Fu and Way of the Exploding Fist in first and second place, with Strike Force Harrier, Gyroscope, Hypersports and Matchday lower down. There are also 3 BBC exclusive titles in the form of Citadel, Speech, which isn't a game, and Repton 2, and once again you can see a compilation in the form of 10 computer hits. I'd say the most noteworthy entry in that chart is Citadel, which has gone up from 8th place in the previous chart to 3rd in this one, no doubt on the back of some decent reviews. Onto the type-in listing from this magazine then. I'll warn you, this one's a bit of a monster as it spans several issues of the magazine. The game's called Under the Mortuary and it's by Sunil Yagoda, if I've pronounced that correctly. The introduction says this is a cartoon-esque arcade adventure game written for the BBC Micro Model B. In Under the Mortuary you must guide Sonny, the Bombay duck who is trapped under a mortuary, to safety. It then covers the objective of the game in a couple of paragraphs, but again I'll leave that till later when I'm looking at the game itself. There's very little information given about the program structure, and it rounds out by saying, this week we'll give you 2 short programs that form the hex loader and game instructions respectively. Firstly, type in the instruction program and save it onto a blank tape, then type in the hexadecimal loader and save it. Next week we'll begin to print the Mammoth Hex listing. So there's already a warning that this one's going to take some serious effort, but it doesn't tell you at this point how many issues it's going to be published in. The answer to that is actually 4. If you knew that from the start, you'd probably take up the author on this offer here at the bottom, where they say, if you don't feel like typing in the program, simply send me £4 and I'll send it to you on tape. So the first 2 programs are printed on these 2 pages, and there's nothing too daunting about them. The instruction program is about 30 lines of basic, and the hex loader program is just another 40 lines of basic. You have to move on to the later issues of the magazine to see just how daunting this program is though. Here's the next instalment, and the introduction to this says after typing in the 2 basic programs last week, this time we begin the machine code that forms the bulk of the program. To do this you'll need to load and run the special loader program marked as figure 1 in the previous week. This includes some useful routines to make entering and particularly saving the code halfway through a lot easier. After giving you more details about how to use that program, it then says yet more code next week and gives another opportunity to just buy the game if you don't want to type it in. And this is the point that most people would have done that, I suspect, when you see 2 pages of endless hex codes printed in barely legible text. The following week's issue of the magazine treats you to another page of more of the same, but this time the introduction says, this week your next dose of data, plus a screen dump from one of the 28 screens, just so you can see all that effort will be worthwhile. But there is no screen dump. And the final instalment of the program comes in the next issue, and it's even worse than all the previous ones, as the text size is even smaller. The last bit of info at the top of this page says, after this week, using the hex loader we printed back in volume 5 number 6, you'll have a block of code saved under the file name prog. This code should be placed on tape directly after the instruction program. Best of luck with the game, it says. I hope you have as much fun playing it as we did. I'd say what you really need is luck typing it in correctly, but if you did manage to, then let's take a look at what the finished product's like. For all this effort, it better be good. The in-game instructions are presented on a single page in mode 7. A little bit of effort's been made with a colour title, but otherwise they're pretty bland and quite cramped. Pressing the spacebar loads the main game in and it's straight into the action. You must help Sonny, the forgotten Bombay duck, find his way out from under the mortuary before the phantom organist drives him insane. You'll find various objects which can help Sonny free himself, which include stakes, coffins, mine shakers, keys and of course the door. Sonny can only carry 1 stake at a time. The control keys are Z and X for left and right and colon and slash for up and down. Some walls may dissolve and lure you into fatal beings or objects, while in some rooms certain objects have to be picked up in a certain order to complete your task. There are 28 different rooms to explore, and scattered amongst them are collapsing walls, spiders, ghouls, chained fireballs, super ghouls and of course all the objects you need to collect. You'll find that the stakes and mine shakers will be used most often. First impressions of this game are really good, as the effort of typing in that huge listing would reward you with multicolour graphics that are well animated, decent sound effects and a background tune. Unfortunately, once you start playing the game it goes downhill fast. The gameplay is excruciatingly difficult as it's incredibly hard to time getting past moving enemies, and all the objects encountered on the first few screens kill you. The collision detection is ridiculously strict, as you have just a split second to get past an enemy or you're dead. You need to push up or down when moving horizontally to stop close to an enemy, then time movement past it precisely. With the game being flick screen, some of the deadly objects are the first thing you run into when going onto a new screen for the first time, which is really bad design and means you can only progress through trial and error. Not that you'll progress much anyway based on my experience. It took me tons of attempts to get past the second screen, where I then managed to explore a few more, then never managed it again and gave up. What I did notice is that something happens with the switches that changes the screen colours, which in turn makes it possible or impossible to collect stakes. I never actually worked out what to do with the stakes, but presumably they let you destroy the hearts. This had the potential to be a decent maze adventure game, but it's absolutely ruined by the insane difficulty level. Imagine spending 4 consecutive weeks laboriously typing it in and then getting this. I'd be enraged, and I know exactly where to send my complaints to because the author's address is printed in all 4 issues of the magazine. I wonder how much hate mail he got. It's that time again where I say thank you to all my channel members, whose names you can see here in my Supporters Hall of Fame. If you're enjoying this video and would like to join these fine folks and support my efforts, why not become a member yourself? For a monthly fee starting from just 99p, you can get access to the special membership perks shown on screen, and more besides. If you're interested, then please click on the join button below this video for more information. If you're not able to commit to a monthly contribution but would still like to support my channel, then you could also give a super thanks. This one-off donation gives you a highlighted comment on whichever video you choose to click the button on, and anyone doing this will also get a shout out from me on a subsequent video. The super thanks button can be found below every video I produce. You can also help raise the profile of this channel by liking this video and leaving a comment, which helps improve my ranking in the mysterious YouTube algorithm. Any support you can give, financial or otherwise, is greatly appreciated. The next magazine I'm going to take a look at is the March 1986 edition of BBug Volume 4 Number 9. This now has a cover price of £1.20, and this is one of the most hideous covers I've seen in this entire series. It really is ugly. It seems to be focused on the idea of using windows and icons, but frankly I've seen enough of it already, so let's move on to the contents page. Here you can see that there's plenty on offer in this edition, including an article about weather satellites, a game called Burger Time, which is what I'm going to be focusing on in this magazine, features about flight simulators and AMX PageMaker, the brand new Master 128, that cover feature about windows and icons, and also some game reviews, and once again you can see Citadel there, so I'll take a look at that too to see how that review compares to the earlier one I looked at. First up in this magazine I'm going to jump to page 7 and this article entitled The Master 128 in Practice, which is an overview of Acorn's brand new BBC computer, and it says following its launch in January, the editorial team have been taking a close look at the Master 128 and now report on their experiences in using the new machine. Clearly I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because there's a lot of information there, but I will just go through the headers, which include View and View Sheet, Basic, the Editor, the Operating System, the Filing Systems, a whole box out about upgrading to Masterclass, which gives you information about how to make your BBC Model B the same standard as the Master, and it looks expensive based on this total estimated price of over £800. So lots of information there, but there's no conclusion about what they think about the system, which is a bit of a shame because that was the only thing I was really going to read out to summarise this article. Never mind, let's move deeper into this magazine, and it actually features a rare colour pull-out supplement, which includes an advert for the BBC Master, so let's take a look at that. This 2-page spread from Acorn bills the new machine as the new BBC microcomputer series that will be seen in all areas, and there's pictures to illustrate that, including a man programming the computer at home, 2 kids using the machine at school, a businessman sat by it in his office, and also some laboratory technicians using it too. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't really make a big deal about the fact that you can also play games on it. So there's a couple of things to pick out from this. Firstly, there are 2 versions of the machine at this point. The base level version costs £499 including VAT, but there's also the option to pick up the Master Turbo. For an extra £125 including VAT, it improves the Master 128's benchmark from 9.2 seconds to a record-breaking 4.6 seconds using BBC Basic. I assume that's CPU speed or something, but it doesn't really make it clear. It later mentions a couple of other variations of the machine, including the Master 512, which gives higher levels of education access to MS-DOS compatible applications for under £500, and also for only £348.26 excluding VAT, I don't know why they've suddenly switched to doing ex-VAT instead of including, you have the Master ET, a powerful custom-built networking terminal. And it goes on to say the EcoNet networking facility is probably the world's best-selling low-cost network, and combined with the Master ET, it affords considerable cost saving without limiting your expansion options, ensuring the BBC Micro's place throughout our education system. There's then another mention of the Master 512 saying it puts all the power of a 16-bit computer under your control for under £1,000. This control comes courtesy of the Gem collection, which provides an icon-driven, simple and easy-to-use environment, as well as a word processor and painting package. Sounds very much like Windows to me, that. And there's yet another upgrade mentioned under the laboratory section. As a simple upgrade to the Master 128, the Master SC provides a powerful scientific computer for under £1,500, a tenth of the price of its nearest mainframe equivalent. I don't imagine it's got anywhere near the power though. It goes on to say naturally it uses all the important scientific languages including ISO Pascal, Fortran 77, C and 32016 assembler as well as BBC Basic. It's a very serious wordy advert reflecting the seriousness of the machine that they're selling, I suppose. Moving on to the games reviews section on page 32 and 33, there are 4 different titles reviewed here, including 2 from Firebird, Microcosm and Star Drifter, both of which cost £3 or less, a compilation called Games Disc 3 from Blue Ribbon Software, which mentions Astro Plumber, a game I looked at very recently in my Witchfinder's Gaming Vault series, and at the top of the page, Superior Software's Citadel, getting a rating of 5 out of 5 stars. The introduction says Citadel is another in a line of graphic adventures which seems to be popular now. There will of course be comparisons with Castle Quest and Wizardor, although I believe that Citadel puts both of these in the shade. I agree with him as it happens. After giving an overview of the backstory for the game and the gameplay, he goes on to say, I can think of no faults in the game and in my opinion Citadel is easily the best arcade adventure on the market. There's not nearly enough room here for me to mention all the special features in the game. Strangely, it's illustrated with a screenshot of the title screen of the game rather than the in-game graphics, but we'll let them off since they gave it such a glowing review. It's certainly more positive than the one I looked at earlier in this video. Let's move on to the type-in listing from this magazine, and as mentioned earlier, it is Burger Time. I don't think I need to dwell on this one too much as it's quite obviously based on the name and also the screenshot here, a clone of the Data East arcade game from 1982. The introduction says Jonathan Temple, the author of several recent games, has come up with another mouth-watering challenge. By come up with, they of course mean cloned. Can you make all the beef burgers while avoiding some rather nasty sausages and become Chef of the Year? There's an overview of the game over several paragraphs which I don't need to dwell on, which also includes details of the keyboard controls and other game options. At the very bottom of this first column it says since the program is fairly long and uses Mode 2 graphics, users with disk systems will need to include these few lines at the beginning of the program, and then there's 4 lines of code that are used to move the game into higher memory or something like that. I'm not entirely sure to be honest. Below the code it says please remember to save the program before using this routine, as pressing break after relocating the program may cause it to be corrupted. The full program listing then follows over the next 3.5 pages with an overall line count of just under 400. From a quick skim through, I don't think there's any machine code used here, it's all in BASIC as far as I can tell, and there's nothing that really stands out in terms of the code used, other than this is the first game I've ever seen with a procedure called sausages. What also amused me is the REM statement on line 50 which says this program's subject to copyright, ironic given that it is itself a copy of somebody else's work. It does look like a listing that's fairly easy to type in, with the text clearly printed and well laid out. Nothing more to say about this one really, so let's move on and see how good a clone of the arcade game this version of Burger Time is. Upon loading the game you're presented with some nice instructions, rendered in mode 7 in a mixture of green and blue text. The first 2 pages tell you how to play the game, while the third gives you the keyboard controls, and pressing a key then moves you onto a very simple title page, and pressing a key from there moves you onto another very simple title page, and eventually after pressing a key again, the game will actually start. I doubt I really need to explain how to play this game, but just in case you've never encountered it before, the overview says Burger Time features that famous chef Mr. Gordon Bleu, whose kitchens have been overrun by deranged sausages bent on world domination. While they chase him, the chef must assemble 4 burgers in each kitchen. The 4 burgers, each split into 4 parts, meat, lettuce and 2 halves of the bun, are suspended at various points in the kitchen. You must knock them down into the cups below to form complete burgers by walking over them. You'll be chased by 2 sausages which can be paralysed for a while by throwing pepper over them. You can only carry 1 pepper pot at a time, and this is indicated at the top left hand of the screen. Additional pepper pots can be collected from the top of the playing area. After the second screen, a strawberry flavoured milkshake appears which can be collected for bonus points. This clone of the classic arcade game certainly looks the part, with similar graphics to the original, recreated as best they can be for a typing game on an 8-bit system. There's no music though, unsurprisingly, and most of the sound effects are simple, but there is a nice noise for when the burger pieces drop. Presentation is of a good standard, with score, lives, level number and a pepper indicator present in-game, and a high score table for when you've finished too. The level layouts vary from stage to stage, which is good and in keeping with the arcade game, though they're not the same in this version. There are however a number of significant changes from the arcade game that affect the gameplay. Levels completely reset when you lose a life, so that makes completing them a bigger challenge. You only have 1 pepper, so have to use it carefully and then go to the top of the screen to get another, but pepper is thrown across the screen rather than staying where you release it, so you don't need to worry as much about when to fire it. Enemies follow you almost all the time and move as fast as you do, so you need to stay ahead of them, but peppered enemies can be walked through and stay stunned for a good while. However, you can't kill or stun enemies by dropping burger pieces on them. Most of these changes sadly make the game a lot harder and more frustrating. If you dwell at the bottom of the screen at the start of a level, you can be trapped with no chance of escaping. You have to move in a horizontal direction when firing the pepper or it just stays still, which can be fatal, and pepper doesn't always respawn very quickly either. The biggest issue though is definitely the entire level resetting when you lose a life, which is very annoying and really slows your progress. I would still say this is a fairly good clone of the arcade game, especially for a basic program, but it is definitely difficult and takes quite a few plays to get to grips with the different game mechanics. Given the arcade game was 4 years old by this point in time, this typing was probably a little late to the party, but the listing is not too onerous if you did want to create your own version of it. For the final magazine and game in this episode, I'm going back to where I started as I look at another edition of the Micro User, this time the March 1986 issue, which is the special 3rd birthday issue according to this flash in the bottom right hand corner. There's definitely some similarities between this one and the first issue I looked at the beginning of this episode, as both of them featured a pull-out guide to one of the BBC Micro's biggest games. The first one featured Elite, but this time they're looking at revs, and the cover is dominated by that fact, with the headline How to Beat the Best at Silverstone, and an image that, well, is nowhere near as good as that one for Elite, let's be honest. There's a hand playing with a joystick, a racing helmet, and a BBC Micro in the background, with a screenshot from the game on the monitor. With the plain blue background, it does very much look like it was patched together, rather than the nice sci-fi imagery of the January issue. The other noteworthy thing on the front cover is in the top right hand corner, and again this is treading similar ground to other magazines I've looked at this episode, as it features an expert hands-on evaluation of the new BBC Master. You've probably already have noticed that the scan quality isn't the best on this issue, with a big black bar down the left hand side, and that's continued throughout the magazine, but it doesn't really stop me reading any of the information. On the subject of the BBC Master, the news pages are dominated by the machine too, with this lead article saying production boost for Master Series. Acorn has ramped up production of its new Master Series, which has been so successful since its launch that sales have exceeded targets by 30%. Officials are having to raise the original forecast that total sales would reach 100,000 by the end of the year, and the new figure is likely to be considerably higher. Acorn's product manager Bob Coates admits they've been caught on the hop by the heavy initial demand. As a result, we've had to up production, he told the Micro User. There are lots of positive comments from people in the industry here, including John Taylor of dealer 3SL in Cheshire, who was unsurprised by the demand, saying the product has been properly designed to meet market requirements and therefore response was always going to be tremendous. Vigland's managing director Vig Boyd said the Master has given the Acorn series a new lease of life. The response we've had to it has been very impressive. It will be the advanced research machine. And Watford Electronics' Nazir Jesser said, I expect our sales to reach thousands in the first quarter. He believed that the Master Series could be even more popular, saying, I think if Acorn lowered its prices, the machine would have no competition. It would sweep the floor with its rivals. I must admit I'm a little bit surprised by this, as the buzz about the Master really passed me by at the time and I didn't think it was that successful. I suppose with its advanced capabilities and price point, it was more aimed at industrial and educational usage rather than the home user. And of course we already had a BBC Micro at home, which was good enough for us at the time. No doubt linked to the impressive reception and desirability of the Master, there's also the announcement that Acorn shares have shot up. Mystery surrounds a sudden and dramatic rise in the value of Acorn computer shares. As that issue of the Micro User went to press, the shares, which at one time were only worth 4p each, were hovering above £1, 3 times what they were valued at only 2 weeks previously. Spokesman for Acorn confessed that the sharp upward valuation in such a short period of time had them baffled, but a rumour circulating in the city that Olivetti, holder of more than 80% of their shares, was bidding for the lot, was dismissed by brokers Phillips and Drew. They went on to say the most likely reason for the sudden activity is that Acorn products have been receiving a lot of good notices in the media. So after their financial problems the previous year, this all seems like good news for Acorn, although the final quote in that article does warn that only time will tell whether this current surge in Acorn share prices is sustainable. So moving on, let's take a look at this article entitled The Master Revealed. Yet more coverage of the BBC Master, but let's get it all out of the way in this one episode, shall we? The introduction says, last month the Micro User presented the first hands-on evaluation of the BBC Master. We called it the most exciting new product from a British computer manufacturer since the original BBC Micro. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? This month, our technical editor, who's called Mike Cook, takes the story a stage further with a look inside the Wonder Machine. Now again, I'm not going to be taking a look at this in too much depth, but I do like the introduction here that says it's always exciting getting your hands on a new computer, and the BBC Master is no exception. On first impressions it looks much wider than the Model B, but in fact proves to be only 2 inches more. Nevertheless, this means that it would no longer slip under my monitor plinth and my disc cable is only just long enough. The main keyboard has been pushed to one side as the ashtray speech extension socket has gone along with the speech synthesizer. At the right hand end is a new numeric keypad, which of course makes it look a little bit like an IBM PC compatible. It goes on to say the brake key is set slightly apart from the other keys and there's a small plastic screw that can be used to mechanically prevent it from being pressed. That's definitely a good idea. The article goes into huge amounts of detail about the system, which as I've said I'm not going to go into, and again, just like the BBug article, there's sections about the system's basic and operating system and a box out about startup options, and it goes into much more detail than the BBug article because you also get an overview of all the chips used in the system, a box out about ROM based software, and even pictures of all the different ports that are available on the back and base of the machine. The final section in this article covers compatibility, and one thing that stood out from here is that despite having a mention in the manual, the author's version of Elite would not run on the new machine. In fact, when you try to run it, the game informs you that the computer is not a BBC Micro. It goes on to say that there is a utility on the welcome disk that claims to convert some software, and when trying this on his version of Elite, the program conceded that it was in fact a BBC Micro, but then sent the disk read head on a never-ending quest for some sector. The piece is rounded off by saying with regard to compatibility, the maxim must be don't expect it to work but be surprised when it does. This again comes as something as a surprise, as I thought they would have made great effort to try and make as much BBC Micro software compatible with the new system as possible. The final thing I'm going to look at in this magazine before moving on to the game listing is this advert from Vigeland, the best partners for your computer, offering all the peripherals for your BBC Model B. And this gave me a huge wave of nostalgia. As you can see, they're offering the opportunity to give your BBC the PC look with the Vigeland Professional Console Unit. This allows you to house your computer, monitor, disk drives and ROM cartridge system neatly in a strongly constructed, high-impact ABS unit, colour matched to the BBC Micro. The most notable thing being a separate keyboard case that allows you to detach the keyboard from the main unit and then house the disk drives above that instead. And the reason for the nostalgia? Well, this is exactly what we had in our household when I was a kid, and I actually still have this unit boxed up in the garage, albeit no longer functioning. It's also a lot more yellow now than it looks in this picture. And with that, I'll move on slightly misty-eyed to the game of the month for this issue, Morris Minor. And the author has a familiar name, as this was written by Jonathan Temple, who was also responsible for Burger Time that I looked at from the BBug magazine. It seems he was certainly a busy boy at this point in time. There's some nice artwork at the top of the page, illustrating the key elements of the gameplay. As you can see, Morris the Miner frantically running along, surrounded by a load of keys, and there's also a ladder in the picture. And there's a screenshot to the right hand side that shows that that's exactly what the game features. The introductory paragraph says, trapped inside the deserted uranium mine workings, Morris the Miner must try to collect the 14 keys which will allow him to escape to the outside world. There's then a ton of extra information about the game, most of which I'm going to skip over, but there are a few interesting things to pick out, as it says although written entirely in BASIC, the game is fairly fast and requires a lot of careful forethought to complete within the time limit. The integer variables A% to Z% are used extensively to speed the program up and save memory. The program also makes use of the indirection operators question mark and exclamation mark to access the data for the interlocking screens and the key and bonus letter positions, which are held in a byte array and two 2-byte arrays respectively. Data for the 7 screens is contained in the format of number of walls, number of ladders, lift X and Y positions, lift X and Y directions, followed by blocks of 3 hex numbers which contain the positions of the individual walls and ladders. It then explains that in more detail before saying anyone wishing to design their own screens will also have to change the bonus letter data lines 1650 to 1670 and the keys data lines 1680 to 1720. So it's basically giving you the instructions on how to create your own level layouts if you wanted to. As with most micro user listings, there's plenty of information about the variables, functions, program structures and procedures given in the box outs at the bottom of the page, and then you have to skip to page 140 to see the actual listing. There we see it takes up 3 pages with a line count of just over 300. Not on the face of it a huge amount of effort, but if you look in more detail, there are a huge number of data statements that are defining those level layouts, so they're going to take some effort to type in correctly. I'm not sure the orange background on these pages was necessarily a good idea, as it does make the text quite hard to read in places, and the font size could be more generous too. Of course, that's no real issue for me because someone else already typed it in and saved me the hassle, so let's check out the fruits of their labours. The 3 pages of instructions for this game have a very similar look to the previous one, and that's not really surprising, is it, given they had the same author. I think this is largely a recreation of the text from the magazine, so let me talk you through them while you check out the gameplay. Morris must try to collect the 14 keys which will allow him to escape to the outside world. You control him using the A, Z, greater than and less than keys, and he can be moved between the 7 interlocking screens which make up the mines. However, you must be careful not to let him fall too far. If he does, he will die. Morris can use the ladders and lifts to move around, but he must avoid the debris which falls from the unstable roof of the mine. The roof is gradually caving in and Morris must escape through the exit before the time limit runs out. Points are awarded for collecting keys and escaping from the mine successfully. The latter depends on the amount of time left, the skill level and the number of lives remaining. Morris can also increase his score by collecting the flashing letters which form the word bonus. Collect them all and a large bonus score is given. Points are awarded throughout the game in proportion to the skill level. The levels range from 1, which is difficult, to 5, which is easy, and these affect the amount of falling debris and the time limit. The presentation in this game is excellent, with the aforementioned choice of difficulty levels, in-game indicators for score, key and lives count, bonus indicator and air supply. It will also retain your high score if you get one. The graphics are pretty good, with the typical brickwork platforms that many games of this era had, functional looking ladders, a pretty simplistic main sprite and nice keys to collect. The sound effects are little more than functional, and are very similar to Burger Time, which is again perhaps not a surprise given both games had the same author. The controls are generally good, though it can be tricky getting on or off ladders and especially lifts, with the timing needing to be just right for the latter. You can die from falling a certain distance, but it's fairly forgiving. You can fall quite a long way, though it's a bit trial and error to work out exactly how far. This is a nicely designed puzzle platformer, as you need to work out the quickest route to get all the keys. You have the freedom to explore the screens however you like to find the best route, and an additional objective of finding the bonus letters, which are in set locations that don't change from one game to the next. It could do with a way to top up the air supply, as this is the biggest barrier to finishing the game. It's also annoying that you get sent back to the first screen when losing a life, as that wastes a lot of that air supply as you retrace your steps. That is part of the challenge though, I suppose. Overall, I found this to be a pretty enjoyable game, offering a good challenge without being annoyingly difficult. It allows you to make more progress each time you play, which in turn gives you the incentive to try again to get a little further. It's actually better than some commercial offerings of this era, despite being a little clunky, and is one I may come back to, which I don't say that often in this series. If you did manage to complete it, those instructions on how to alter the screen layout means there's the opportunity to tweak the game and give it more longevity too. That brings this episode of the history of BBC Micro typing games to a close, and my first episode looking at listings from 1986 has seen a few interesting offerings. What should have been the best game in this episode based on the size of the listing, Under the Mortuary, turned out to be a huge disappointment, though at least I didn't have the misfortune of actually typing it in. Of the other games, Megaroids and Locomotion weren't anything to write home about, but Burger Time was a reasonable if occasionally frustrating clone of the arcade classic. The standout game this time though was Morris Minor, a cleverly designed, replayable and fairly good looking game that is definitely worth a look. I don't think we've seen anything that's a huge advancement over listings from 1985 yet, other than that obvious 4-issue monstrosity, but we'll see if that changes in future episodes of this series. I'll try not to leave it so long for the next one, I promise. If you enjoyed this video then please give it a like and let me know any thoughts you have about the games or magazines I've looked at in the video comments. As always, the pinned comment on this video features links to both the games and mags if you want to explore them further. If you'd like to support my efforts and influence the future direction of this channel, please click on the join button below the video for more information about becoming a member. Until the next episode of this series, you can be sure of more retro gaming content on this channel, so please stay tuned for that. I hope you enjoyed this long awaited return to this series, thanks very much for watching the video, and until the next time, see ya!